weekly. Each Friday, this report showed a large increase in loans. Each Friday, it was firmly stated that it didn't mean a thing, and anyone who suggested otherwise was administered a stern rebuke. It seems probable that only a minority of the people in the market related the volume of the broker's loans to the volume of purchases on margin, and thence to the amount of speculation. Accordingly, an expression of concern over these loans was easily attacked as a gratuitous effort to undermine confidence. Thus, in Barron's on July 8th, Sheldon Sinclair Wells explained that those who worried about brokers' loans and about the influx of funds from corporations simply did not know what was going on. The call market had become a great new investment outlet for corporate reserves, he argued. The critics did not appreciate this change. Chairman Mitchell of the National City Bank, by nature an equable man, was repeatedly angered by the attention being given to brokers' loans and expressed himself strongly. The financial press was also disturbed, and when Arthur Brisbane, later in the year, questioned the propriety of a 10% call rate, the Wall Street Journal reached the end of its patience. Even in general newspapers, some accurate knowledge is required for discussing most things. Why is it that any ignoramus can talk about Wall Street? It does seem possible that Brisbane thought the rate was 10% a day rather than a year. Scholars also reacted against those who, deliberately or otherwise, were sabotaging prosperity with their unguarded pessimism. After soberly viewing the situation, Professor Dice concluded that the high level of brokers' loans should not be as greatly feared as some would have us believe. In August, the Midland Bank of Cleveland made public the results of calculations, which proved that until loans by corporations in the stock market reached $12 billion, there was no cause for concern. The best reassurance on brokers' loans was in the outlook for the market. If stocks remained high and went higher, and if they did so because their prospects justified their price, then there was no occasion to worry about the loans that were piling up. Accordingly, much of the defense of the loans consisted in defending the levels of the market. It was not hard to persuade people that the market was sound. As always in such times, they asked only that the disturbing voices of doubt be muted, and that there be tolerably frequent expressions of confidence. In 1929, treason had not yet become a casual term of reproach. As a result, pessimism was not openly equated with efforts to destroy the American way of life. Yet it had such connotations. Almost without exception, those who expressed concern said subsequently that they did so with fear and trepidation. Later in the year, a Boston firm of investment counselors struck a modern note with a widely publicized warning that America had no place for deconstructionists. The official optimists were many and articulate. Thus, in June, Bernard Baruch told Bruce Barton, in a famous interview published in The American Magazine, that the economic condition of the world seems on the verge of a great forward movement. He pointed out that no bears had houses on Fifth Avenue. Numerous college professors also exuded scientific confidence. In light of later developments, the record of the Ivy League was especially unfortunate. In a statement which achieved minor notoriety, Lawrence of Princeton said that the consensus of judgment of the millions whose valuations function on that admirable market, the stock exchange, is that stocks are not at present overvalued. He added, "Where is that group of men with the all-embracing wisdom which will entitle them to veto the judgment of this intelligent multitude?" That autumn, Professor Irving Fisher of Yale made his immortal estimate. Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. Irving Fisher was the most original of American economists. Happily, there are better things. His contributions to index numbers, technical economic theory, and monetary theory, for which he is remembered. From Cambridge, slightly less spacious reassurance came from the Harvard Economic Society, an extracurricular enterprise conducted by a number of economics professors of unexceptionable conservatism. The purpose of the society was to help businessmen and speculators foretell the future. Forecasts were made several times a month, and undoubtedly gained in stature from their association with the august name of the university. By wisdom, or good luck, the society in early 1929 was mildly bearish. Its forecasters had happened to decide that a recession, though assuredly not a depression, was overdue. Week by week, they foretold a slight setback in business. When, by the summer of 1929, the setback had not appeared, at least in any very visible form, the society gave up and confessed error. Business, it decided, might be good after all. This, as such things are judged, was still a creditable record. But then came the crash. The society remained persuaded that no serious depression was in prospect. In November, it said firmly that a severe depression like that of 1920 to 1921 is outside the range of probability. We are not facing protracted liquidation. This view the society reiterated until it was liquidated. 3. The bankers were also a source of encouragement to those who wished to believe in the permanence of the boom. A great many of them abandoned their historic role as the guardians of the nation's fiscal pessimism and enjoyed a brief respite of optimism. They had reasons for doing so. In the years preceding, a considerable number of the commercial banks, including the largest of the New York houses, had organized securities affiliates. These affiliates sold stocks and bonds to the public, and this business had become important. It was a business that compelled a rosy view of the future. In addition, individual bankers, perhaps taking a cue from the heads of the National City and Chase in New York, were speculating vigorously on their own behalf. They were unlikely to say, much less to advocate, anything that would jar the market. However, there were exceptions. One was Paul M. Warburg of the International Acceptance Bank, whose predictions must be accorded the same prominence as the forecasts of Irving Fisher. They were remarkably prescient. In March of 1929, he called for a stronger Federal Reserve policy and argued that if the present orgy of unrestrained speculation were not brought promptly to a halt, there would ultimately be a disastrous collapse. This, he suggested, would be unfortunate not alone for the speculators. It would bring about a general depression involving the entire country. Only Wall Street spokesmen who took the most charitable view of Warburg contented themselves with describing him as obsolete. One said he was sandbagging American prosperity. Others hinted that he had a motive, presumably a short position. As the market went up and up, his warnings were recalled only with contempt. The most notable skeptics were provided by the press. They were a great minority, to be sure. Most magazines and most newspapers in 1929 reported the upward sweep of the market with admiration and awe, and without alarm. They viewed both the present and the future with exuberance. Moreover, by 1929, numerous journalists were sternly resisting the more subtle blandishments and flattery to which they have been thought susceptible. Instead, they were demanding cold cash for news favorable to the market. A financial columnist of the Daily News, who signed himself The Trader, received some $19,000 in 1929 and early 1930 from a freelance operator named John J. Levinson. The Trader repeatedly spoke well of stocks in which Mr. Levinson was interested. Mr. Levinson later insisted, however, that this was a coincidence and that the payment reflected his more or less habitual generosity. A radio commentator named William J. McMahon was the president of the McMahon Institute of Economic Research, an organization that was mostly McMahon. He told in his broadcast of the brilliant prospects of stocks which pool operators were seeking to boom. For this, it later developed, he received an honorarium of $250 a week from a certain David M. Lyon. Mr. Lyon was one of several whom the Pecora Committee reported as making a business of buying favorable comment in the necessary amount at the proper moment. At the other extreme was the best of the financial press. The established financial services like Poor's and that of the Standard Statistics Company never lost touch with reality. In the autumn, Poor's weekly business and investment letter went so far as to speak of the Great Common Stock Delusion. The editor of the Commercial and Financial Chronicle was never quite shaken in his conviction that Wall Street had taken leave of its senses. The weekly reports on the brokers' loans were regularly the occasion for a solemn warning. The news columns featured any available bad news. However, by far the greatest force for sobriety was the New York Times. Under the guidance of the veteran Alexander Dana Noyes, its financial page was all but immune to the blandishments of the new era. A regular reader could not doubt that a day of reckoning was expected. Also, on several occasions it reported, much too prematurely, that the day of reckoning had arrived. Indeed, the temporary breaks in the market which preceded the crash were a serious trial for those who had declined fantasy. Early in 1928, in June, in December, and in February and March of 1929, it seemed that the end had come. On various of these occasions, the Times happily reported the return to reality. And then the market took flight again. Only a durable sense of doom could survive such discouragement. The time was coming when the optimists would reap a rich harvest of discredit. But it has long since been forgotten that for many months, those who resisted reassurance were similarly, if less permanently, discredited. To say that the Times, when the real crash came, reported the event with jubilation would be an exaggeration. Nevertheless, it covered it with an unmistakable absence of sorrow. 4. By the summer of 1929, the market not only dominated the news, it also dominated the culture. That recherche minority which, at other times, has acknowledged its interest in St. Thomas Aquinas, Proust, psychoanalysis, and psychosomatic medicine, then spoke of United Corporation, United Founders, and Steel. Only the most aggressive of the eccentrics maintained their detachment from the market and their interest in autosuggestion or communism. Main Street had always had one citizen who could speak knowingly about buying or selling stocks. Now, he became an oracle. In New York, on the edge of any gathering of significantly interesting people, there had long been a literate broker or investment counselor who was abreast of current plans for pools, syndicates, and mergers, and was aware of attractive possibilities. He helpfully advised his friends on investments, and pressed, he would always tell what he knew of the market, and much that he didn't. Now, these men, even in the company of artists, playwrights, poets, and beautiful concubines, suddenly shone forth. Their words, more or less literally, became golden. Their audience listened not with the casual heed of people who are collecting quotable epigrams, but with the truly rapt attention of those who expect to make money by what they hear. That much of what was repeated about the market, then as now, bore no relation to reality is important, but not remarkable. Between human beings, there is a type of intercourse which proceeds not from knowledge, or even from lack of knowledge, but from failure to know what isn't known. This was true of much of the discourse on the market. At luncheon in downtown Scranton, the knowledgeable physician spoke of the impending split-up in the stock of Western utility investors and the effect on prices. Neither the doctor nor his listeners knew why there should be a split-up, why it should increase values, or even why Western utility investors should have any value. But neither the doctor nor his audience knew that he did not know. Wisdom itself is often an abstraction associated not with fact or reality, but with the man who asserts it and the manner of its assertion. Perhaps the failure to visualize the extent of one's innocence was especially true of women investors, who by now were entering the market in increasing numbers. An article in the North American Review in April reported that women had become important players of man's most exciting capitalistic game, and that the modern housewife now reads, for instance, that Right Arrow is going up, just as she does that fresh fish is now on the market. The author hazarded the guess that success in speculation would do a lot for women's prestige. To the typical female plunger, the association of Steel was not with a corporation, and certainly not with mines, ships, railroads, blast furnaces, and open hearths. Rather, it was with symbols on a tape and lines on a chart and a price that went up. She spoke of steel with the familiarity of an old friend, when in fact she knew nothing of it whatever. Nor would anyone tell her that she did not know that she did not know. We are a polite and cautious people, and we avoid unpleasantness. Moreover, such advice, so far from accomplishing any result, would only have inspired a feeling of contempt for anyone who lacked the courage and the initiative and the sophistication to see how easily one could become rich. The lady operator had discovered she could be rich. Surely her right to be rich was as good as anyone's. One of the uses of women is that their motivations, though often similar, are less elaborately disguised than those of men. The values of a society totally preoccupied with making money are not altogether reassuring. During the summer, the Times accepted the copy of a dealer in the securities of the National Waterworks Corporation, a company which had been organized to buy into city water companies. The advertisement carried the following acquisitive thought. Picture this scene today, if by some cataclysm only one small well should remain for the great city of New York. $1 a bucket, $100, $1,000, $1 million. The man who owned the well would own the wealth of the city. All cataclysmically minded investors were urged to get a long position in water before it was too late. 5. The polar role of the stock market in American life in the summer of 1929 is beyond doubt. And many people of many different kinds and condition were in the stock market. Frederick Lewis Allen pictured the diversity of this participation in a fine passage. The rich man's chauffeur drove with his ears laid back to catch the news of an impending move in Bethlehem Steel. He held 50 shares himself on a 20-point margin. The window cleaner at the broker's office paused to watch the ticker, for he was thinking of converting his laboriously accumulated savings into a few shares of Simmons. Edwin Lefevre, an articulate reporter on the market at this time who could claim considerable personal experience, told of a broker's valet who made nearly $250,000 in the market, of a trained nurse who cleaned up $30,000 following the tips given her by grateful patients, and of a Wyoming cattleman, 30 miles from the nearest railroad, who bought or sold 1,000 shares a day. Yet there is probably more danger of overestimating, rather than underestimating, the popular interest in the market. The cliché that by 1929 everyone was in the market is far from the literal truth. Then, as now, to the great majority of workers, farmers, white-collar workers, indeed, to the great majority of all Americans, the stock market was a remote and vaguely ominous thing. Then, as now, not many knew how one went about buying a security. The purchase of stocks on margin was, in every respect, as remote from life as the casino at Monte Carlo. In later years, a Senate committee investigating the securities markets undertook to ascertain the number of people who were involved in securities speculation in 1929. The member firms of 29 exchanges in that year reported themselves as having accounts with a total of 1,548,707 customers. Of these, 1,371,920 were customers of member firms of the New York Stock Exchange. Thus, only 1.5 million people, out of a population of approximately 120 million and of between 29 and 30 million families, had an active association of any sort with the stock market. And not all of these were speculators. Brokerage firms estimated for the Senate committee that only about 600,000 of the accounts just mentioned were for margin trading, as compared with roughly 950,000 in which trading was for cash. The figure of 600,000 for margin traders involves some duplication. A few large operators had accounts with more than one broker. There were also some traders whose operations were insignificant. However, some speculators are included among the 950,000 cash customers. Some were putting up the full purchase price for their securities, although speculating nonetheless. Some were borrowing money outside the market and posting the securities as collateral. Though listed as cash customers, they were in effect buying on margin. However, it is safe to say that at the peak in 1929, the number of active speculators was less, and probably was much less, than 1 million. Between the end of 1928 and the end of July of 1929, a period when the popular folklore has Americans rushing like lemmings to participate in the market, the number of margin accounts on all of the exchanges of the country increased by only slightly more than 50,000. The striking thing about the stock market speculation of 1929 was not the massiveness of the participation. Rather, it was the way it became central to the culture. 6. By the end of the summer of 1929, brokers' bulletins and letters no longer contented themselves with saying what stocks would rise that day and by how much. They went on to say that at 2 p.m., Radio or General Motors would be taken in hand. The conviction that the market had become the personal instrument of mysterious but omnipotent men was never stronger. And, indeed, this was a period of exceedingly active pool and syndicate operations. In short, of manipulation. During 1929, more than 100 issues on the New York Stock Exchange were subject to manipulative operations, in which members of the exchange or their partners had participated. The nature of these operations varied somewhat, but in a typical operation, a number of traders pooled their resources to boom a particular stock. They appointed a pool manager, promised not to double-cross each other by private operations, and the pool manager then took a position in the stock which might also include shares contributed by the participants. This buying would increase prices and attract the interest of people watching the tape across the country. The interest of the latter would then be further stimulated by active selling and buying, all of which gave the impression that something big was afloat. Tip sheets and market commentators would tell of exciting developments in the offing. If all went well, the public would come in to buy, and prices would rise on their own. The pool manager would then sell out, pay himself a percentage of the profits, and divide the rest with his investors. While it lasted, there was never a more agreeable way of making money. The public at large sensed the attractiveness of these operations, and as the summer passed, it came to be supposed that Wall Street was concerned with little else. This was an exaggeration, but it did not discourage public activity in the market. People did not believe they were being shorn, nor were they. Both they and the pool operators were making money, with the difference only that the latter were making more. In any case, the public reaction to inside operations was to hope that it might get some inside information on these operations and so get a cut in the profits that the great men like Cutton, Livermore, Raskob, and the rest were making. As the market came to be considered less and less a long-run register of corporate prospects and more a product of manipulative artifice, the speculator was required to give it his closest and preferably his undivided attention. Signs of incipient pool activity had to be detected at the earliest possible moment, which meant that one needed to have his eyes on the tape. However, even the person who was relying on hunches, incantations, or simple faith, as distinct from the effort to assess the intentions of the professionals, found it hard to be out of touch. Only in the case of the rarest individuals can speculation be a part-time activity. Money for most people is far too important. Of the South Sea bubble, it was observed that statesmen forgot their politics, lawyers the bar, merchants their traffic, physicians their patients, tradesmen their shops, debtors of quality their creditors, divines the pulpit, and even the women themselves their pride and vanity. And so it was in 1929. Brokers' offices were crowded from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. with seated or standing customers, who, instead of attending to their own business, were watching the blackboard. In some customers' rooms, it was difficult to get access to a spot from which the posted quotations could be seen. No one could get a chance to inspect the tape. It follows that to be out of touch with the market, ever so briefly, was a nerve-wracking experience. Happily, this was not often necessary. Ticker service was now nationwide. A local telephone call would get the latest quotations from almost anywhere. A journey to Europe provided one of the few troublesome exceptions. As the Literary Digest pointed out during the course of the summer, transoceanic brokerage business has been growing to immense proportions. But there has been an interlude of uncertainty and inconvenience for speculators crossing the ocean. In August, even this interlude was eliminated. Progressive brokerage houses. A leader was M.J. Meehan, the specialist in radio and a veteran of many notable manipulations, installed branches on the big ships under special regulations laid down by the exchange. On August 17th, the Leviathan and the Ile de France left port fully equipped for speculation on the high seas. Business on the Ile the opening day was described as brisk. One of the first transactions was by Irving Berlin, who sold 1,000 shares of Paramount Famous Lasky at 72. It was a shrewd move. The stock later went more or less to nothing, and the company into bankruptcy. In Spokane, an anonymous poet on the editorial staff of the Spokesman Review celebrated the seagoing boardrooms. We were crowded in the cabin, watching figures on the board. It was midnight on the ocean, and a tempest loudly roared. "We are lost," the captain shouted as he staggered down the stairs. "I've got a tip," he faltered, "straight by wireless from the aunt of a fellow who's related to a cousin of Durant." At these awful words we shuddered, and the stoutest bull grew sick, while the brokers cried, "More margin," and the ticker ceased to tick. But the captain's little daughter said, "I do not understand. Isn't Morgan on the ocean just the same as on the land?" 7. Labor Day brought the summer of 1929 to its conventional end on September 2nd. There was a severe heat wave, and on the evening of the holiday, returning motorists tied up the roads around New York for miles. In the end, many were forced to abandon their vehicles and make their way home by train or subway. On September 3rd, the city continued to swelter in what the Weather Bureau reported was the hottest day of the year. Away from Wall Street, this was a very quiet day in a very tranquil time. Years later, Frederick Lewis Allen went to the newspapers for that day and, in a charming article, told all that he found. There wasn't much. Disarmament was being discussed in that customarily desultory fashion which doubtless in the end will destroy us. The Graf Zeppelin was nearing the end of its first round-the-world flight. A tri-motored plane of transcontinental air transport had crashed in a thunderstorm in New Mexico, and 8 were killed. The line had only recently inaugurated a 48-hour service to the West Coast. Railway sleeper to Columbus, Ohio, plane to Anoka, Oklahoma, sleeper again to Clovis, New Mexico, and a plane the rest of the way. Babe Ruth had knocked out 40 home runs so far in the season. As a bestseller, All Quiet on the Western Front held a commanding lead over Dodsworth. Women's dresses were all emphasizing a decidedly flat look, without anyone saying so. From Washington it was announced that Harry F. Sinclair, then in the District of Columbia jail for being in contempt of the Senate during the Teapot Dome investigations, would henceforth be more closely confined. Previously, he had been going daily by automobile to the office of the jail physician, whom he was serving as a pharmaceutical assistant. Earlier in the year, Sinclair's stock market operations were on a huge scale, and they were later the subject of detailed investigation. It was never shown whether the Washington sojourn involved any important interruption. It seems most unlikely that it did. Mr. Sinclair was one of the most resourceful and resilient entrepreneurs of his generation. On September 3rd, sales on the New York Stock Exchange were 4,438,910 shares. Call money was 9% all day. The rate at the banks on prime commercial paper was 6.5%. The rediscount rate at the New York Federal Reserve Bank was 6%. The market was strong, with what the market reporters called a good undertone. American Tel reached 304 that day. U.S. Steel reached 262. General Electric was 396, JIC's 350, New York Central, 256. Radio Corporation of America, adjusted for earlier split-ups and still not having paid a dividend, was 505. The broker's loan figures of the Federal Reserve, when they were released, also showed another huge increase. $137 million in 1 week. The New York banks were also borrowing heavily from the Federal Reserve to carry the speculative superstructure. Their borrowings during the week increased by $64 million. In August, the flow of gold to New York from abroad had continued large. Yet the new month seemed to be opening well. There were several expressions of confidence. On September 3rd, by common consent, the great bull market of the 1920s came to an end. Economics, as always, vouchsafes us few dramatic turning points. Its events are invariably fuzzy or even indeterminate. On some days that followed, a few only, some averages were actually higher. However, never again did the market manifest its old confidence. The later peaks were not peaks, but brief interruptions of a downward trend. On September 4th, the tone of the market was still good, and then on September 5th came a break. The Times Industrials dropped 10 points, and many individual stocks much more. The blue chips held up fairly well, although steel went from 255 to 246, while Westinghouse lost 7 points and Tel 6. Volume mounted sharply as people sought to unload, and 5,565,280 shares were traded on the New York Stock Exchange. The immediate cause of the break was clear and interesting. Speaking before his annual National Business Conference on September 5th, Roger Babson observed, "Sooner or later a crash is coming, and it may be terrific." He suggested that what had happened in Florida would now happen in Wall Street, and with customary precision stated that the Dow Jones market averages would probably drop 60 to 80 points. In a burst of cheer, he concluded that factories will shut down, men will be thrown out of work, the vicious circle will get in full swing, and the result will be a serious business depression. This was not exactly reassuring, yet it was a problem why the market suddenly should pay attention to Babson. As many hastened to say, he had made many predictions before, and they had not affected prices much one way or another. Moreover, Babson was not a man who inspired confidence as a prophet in the manner of Irving Fisher or the Harvard Economic Society. As an educator, philosopher, theologian, statistician, forecaster, economist, and friend of the law of gravity, he had sometimes been thought to spread himself too thin. The methods by which he reached his conclusions were a problem. They involved a hocus-pocus of lines and areas on a chart. Intuition, and possibly even mysticism, played a part. Those who employed rational, objective, and scientific methods were naturally uneasy about Babson, although their methods failed to foretell the crash. In these matters, as often in our culture, it is far, far better to be wrong in a respectable way than to be right for the wrong reasons. Wall Street was not at a loss as to what to do about Babson. It promptly and soundly denounced him. Barron's, in an editorial on September 9th, referred to him with heavy irony as the Sage of Wellesley, and said he should not be taken seriously by anyone acquainted with the notorious inaccuracy of his past statements. The stock exchange house of Hornblower and Weeks sternly told its customers, "We would not be stampeded into selling stocks because of a gratuitous forecast of a bad break in the market by a well-known statistician." Irving Fisher also took issue. He noted that dividends were rising, that the suspicion of common stocks was receding, and that investment trusts now offered the investor wide and well-managed diversification. His own conclusion was, "There may be a recession in stock prices, but not anything in the nature of a crash." Developing a slightly different theme, a Boston investment trust told the public that it should be prepared for slight setbacks, but it should realize that they would soon pass. In large advertisements, it pointed out that, when temporary breaks come, indentations in the ever-ascending curve of American prosperity, individual stocks, even of the most successful companies, go down with the general list. However, it also stated on its own behalf that Incorporated Investors lands on a cushion. The Babson break, as it was promptly called, came on a Thursday. The market rallied on Friday and was firm on Saturday. People seemed to be over their fear. It looked as though the ever-ascending curve would start up again, as so often before, and Mr. Babson notwithstanding. Then, on the following week, the week of September 9th, prices were again ragged. On Monday, the Times, with the caution born of much premature pessimism, hinted that the end had come, and added, "It is a well-known characteristic of boom times that the idea of their being terminated in the old, unpleasant way is rarely recognized as possible." On Wednesday, in a fine example of market prose, the Wall Street Journal observed that price movements in the main body of stocks yesterday continued to display the characteristics of a major advance, temporarily halted for technical readjustment. The unevenness continued. On some days, the market was strong. On others, it was weak. The direction was slightly, erratically, but viewed in retrospect, quite definitely down. New investment trusts were still being formed. More speculators were flocking to the market, and the volume of brokers' loans continued sharply up. The end had come, but it was not yet in sight. Perhaps this was as well. The last moments of life should be cherished, as Wall Street had been told. On September 11th, in keeping with a regular practice, the Wall Street Journal printed its thought for the day. It was from Mark Twain. "Don't part with your illusions. When they are gone, you may still exist, but you have ceased to live." Chapter 5. The Crash. According to the accepted view of events, by the autumn of 1929, the economy was well into a depression. In June, the indexes of industrial and of factory production both reached a peak and turned down. By October, the Federal Reserve Index of industrial production stood at 117, as compared with 126 4 months earlier. Steel production declined from June on. In October, freight car loadings fell. Home building, a most mercurial industry, had been falling for several years, and it slumped still farther in 1929. Finally, down came the stock market. A penetrating student of the economic behavior of this period has said that the market slump reflected, in the main, the change which was already apparent in the industrial situation. Thus viewed, the stock market is but a mirror which, perhaps as in this instance, somewhat belatedly provides an image of the underlying or fundamental economic situation. Cause and effect run from the economy to the stock market, never the reverse. In 1929, the economy was headed for trouble. Eventually, that trouble was violently reflected in Wall Street. In 1929, there were good, or at least strategic, reasons for this view, and it is easy to understand why it has become high doctrine. In Wall Street, as elsewhere in 1929, few people wanted a bad depression. In Wall Street, as elsewhere, there is deep faith in the power of incantation. When the market fell, many Wall Street citizens immediately sensed the real danger, which was that income and employment, prosperity in general, would be adversely affected. This had to be prevented. Preventive incantation required that as many important people as possible repeat as firmly as they could that it wouldn't happen. This they did. They explained how the stock market was merely the froth, and that the real substance of economic life rested in production, employment, and spending, all of which would remain unaffected. No one knew for sure that this was so. As an instrument of economic policy, incantation does not permit of minor doubts or scruples. In the later years of depression, it was important to continue emphasizing the unimportance of the stock market. The depression was an exceptionally disagreeable experience. Wall Street has not always been a cherished symbol in our national life. In some of the devout regions of the nation, those who speculate in stocks, the even more opprobrious term gamblers is used, are not counted the greatest moral adornments of our society. Any explanation of the Depression which attributed importance to the market collapse would accordingly have been taken very seriously, and it would have meant serious trouble for Wall Street. Wall Street no doubt would have survived, but there would have been scars. We should be clear that no deliberate conspiracy existed to minimize the consequences of the Wall Street crash for the economy. Rather, it merely appeared to everyone with an instinct for conservative survival that Wall Street had better be kept out of it. It was vulnerable. In fact, any satisfactory explanation of the events of the autumn of 1929 and thereafter must accord a dignified role to the speculative boom and ensuing collapse. Until September or October of 1929, the decline in economic activity was very modest. As I shall argue later, until after the market crash, one could reasonably assume that this downward movement might soon reverse itself, as a similar movement had reversed itself in 1927, or did subsequently in 1949. There were no reasons for expecting disaster. No one could foresee that production, prices, incomes, and all other indicators would continue to shrink through 3 long and dismal years. Only after the market crash were there plausible grounds to suppose that things might now, for a long while, get a lot worse. From the foregoing, it follows that the crash did not come, as some have suggested, because the market suddenly became aware that a serious depression was in the offing. A depression, serious or otherwise, could not be foreseen when the market fell. There is still the possibility that the downturn in the indexes frightened the speculators, led them to unload their stocks, and so punctured a bubble that had in any case to be punctured one day. This is more plausible. Some people who were watching the indexes may have been persuaded by this intelligence to sell, and others may then have been encouraged to follow. This is not very important, for it is in the nature of a speculative boom that almost anything can collapse it. Any serious shock to confidence can cause sales by those speculators who have always hoped to get out before the final collapse, but after all possible gains from rising prices have been reaped. Their pessimism will infect those simpler souls who had thought the market might go up forever, but who now will change their minds and sell. Soon there will be margin calls, and still others will be forced to sell. So the bubble breaks. Along with the downturn of the indexes, Wall Street has always attributed importance to 2 other events in the pricking of the bubble. In England, on September 20th, 1929, the enterprises of Clarence Hatry suddenly collapsed. Hatry was one of those curiously un-English figures with whom the English periodically find themselves unable to cope. Although his earlier financial history had been anything but reassuring, Hatry in the 20s had built up an industrial and financial empire of truly impressive proportions. The nucleus, all the more remarkably, was a line of coin-in-the-slot vending and automatic photograph machines. From these unprepossessing enterprises, he had marched on into investment trusts and high finance. His expansion owed much to the issuance of unauthorized stock, the increase of assets by the forging of stock certificates, and other equally informal financing. In the lore of 1929, the unmasking of Hatry in London is supposed to have struck a sharp blow to confidence in New York. Ranking with Hatry in this lore was the refusal on October 11th of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities to allow Boston Edison to split its stock 4-1. As the company argued, such split-ups were much in fashion. To avoid going along was to risk being considered back in the corporate gaslight era. The refusal was unprecedented. Moreover, the department added insult to injury by announcing an investigation of the company's rates, and by suggesting that the present value of the stock, due to the action of speculators, had reached a level where no one, in our judgment, on the basis of its earnings, would find it to his advantage to buy it. These were uncouth words. They could have been important, as, conceivably, could have been the exposure of Clarence Hatry. But it could also be that the inherently unstable equilibrium was shattered simply by a spontaneous decision to get out. On September 22nd, the financial pages of the New York papers carried an advertisement of an investment service with the arresting headline, "Overstaying a Bull Market." Its message read as follows: "Most investors make money in a bull market, only to lose all profits made, and sometimes more, in the readjustment that inevitably follows." Instead of the downturn in the Federal Reserve Industrial Index, the exposure of hatchery, or the unnatural obstinacy of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, it could have been such thoughts stirring first in dozens and then in hundreds, and finally in thousands of breasts, which finally brought an end to the boom. What first stirred these doubts we do not know, but neither is it very important that we know. 2. Confidence did not disintegrate at once. As noted, through September and into October, although the trend of the market was generally down, good days came with the bad. Volume was high. On the New York Stock Exchange, sales were nearly always above 4 million, and frequently above 5. In September, new issues appeared in even greater volume than in August, and they regularly commanded a premium over the offering price. On September 20th, the Times noted that the stock of the recently launched Lehman Corporation, which had been offered at $104, had sold the day before at $136. In the case of this well-managed investment trust, the public enthusiasm was not entirely misguided. During September, brokers' loans increased by nearly $670 million, by far the largest increase of any month to date. This showed that speculative zeal had not diminished. Other signs indicated that the gods of the new era were still in their temples. In its October 12th issue, the Saturday Evening Post had a lead story by Isaac F. Marcoson on Ivar Kruger. This was a scoop, for Kruger had previously been inaccessible to journalists. Kruger, Marcoson observed, like Hoover, is an engineer. He has consistently applied engineer precision to the welding of his far-flung industry. And this was not the only resemblance. Like Hoover, the author added, Kruger rules through pure reason. In the interview, Kruger was remarkably candid on one point. He told Mr. Marcoson, "Whatever success I have had may perhaps be attributable to 3 things. One is silence, the second is more silence, while the third is still more silence." This was so. 2.5 years later, Kruger committed suicide in his Paris apartment. And shortly thereafter, it was discovered that his aversion to divulging information, especially if accurate, had kept even his most intimate acquaintances in ignorance of the greatest fraud in history. His American underwriters, the eminently respectable firm of Lee, Higginson and Company of Boston, had heard nothing and knew nothing. One of the members of the firm, Donald Durant, was a member of the board of directors of the Kruger Enterprises. He had never attended a directors' meeting, and it is certain that he would have been no wiser had he done so. During the last weeks of October, Time magazine, young and not yet omniscient, also featured Kruger on its cover. A great admirer of Cecil Rhodes. Then a week later, as though to emphasize its faith in the new era, it went on to Samuel Insull. A fortnight after that, its youthful illusions shattered, the weekly news magazine gave the place of historic honor to Warden Laws of Sing Sing. In these same Indian summer days, the Wall Street Journal took notice of the official announcement that Andrew Mellon would remain in the cabinet at least until 1933. There had been rumors that he might resign, and observed, "Optimism again prevails. The announcement did more to restore confidence than anything else." In Germany, Charles E. Mitchell announced that the industrial condition of the United States is absolutely sound, that too much attention was being paid to brokers' loans, and that nothing can arrest the upward movement. On October 15th, as he sailed for home, he enlarged on the point. The markets generally are now in a healthy condition. Values have a sound basis in the general prosperity of our country. That same evening, Professor Irving Fisher made his historic announcement about the permanently high plateau and added, "I expect to see the stock market a good deal higher than it is today within a few months." Indeed, the only disturbing thing in these October days was the fairly steady downward drift in the market. 3. On Saturday, October 19th, Washington dispatches reported that Secretary of Commerce Lamont was having trouble finding the $100,000 in public funds that would be required to pay the upkeep of the yacht Corsair, which J.P. Morgan had just given the government. Morgan's deprivation was not extreme. A new $3 million Corsair was being readied at Bath, Maine. There were other and more compelling indications of an unaccustomed stringency. The papers told of a very weak market the day before. There were heavy declines on late trading, and the Times Industrial Average had dropped about 7 points. Steel had lost 7 points. General Electric, Westinghouse, and Montgomery Ward all lost 6. Meanwhile, that day's market was behaving very badly. In the second heaviest Saturday's trading in history, 3,488,100 shares were changing hands. At the close, the Times Industrials were down 12 points. The blue chips were seriously off, and speculative favorites had gone into a nosedive. J.I. Case, for example, had fallen a full 40 points. On Sunday, the market was front-page news. The Times headline read, "Stocks driven down as wave of selling engulfs the market." And the financial editor next day reported for perhaps the 10th time that the end had come. He had learned, however, to hedge. For the time, at any rate, he said, Wall Street seemed to see the reality of things. No immediate explanation of the break was forthcoming. The Federal Reserve had long been quiet. Babson had said nothing new. Hatry and the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities were from a week to a month in the past. They became explanations only later. The papers that Sunday carried 3 comments which were to become familiar in the days that followed. After Saturday's trading, it was noted, quite a few margin calls went out. This meant that the value of stock which the recipients held on margin had declined to the point where it was no longer sufficient collateral for the loan that had paid for it. The speculator was being asked for more cash. The other 2 observations were more reassuring. The papers agreed, and this was also the informed view on Wall Street, that the worst was over. And it was predicted that on the following day, the market would begin to receive organized support. Weakness, should it appear, would be tolerated no longer. Never was there a phrase with more magic than organized support. Almost immediately, it was on every tongue and in every news story about the market. Organized support meant that powerful people would organize to keep prices of stocks at a reasonable level. Opinions differed as to who would organize this support. Some had in mind the big operators like Cutton, Durant, and Raskob. They, of all people, couldn't afford a collapse. Some thought of the bankers. Charles Mitchell had acted once before, and certainly if things got bad, he would act again. Some had in mind the investment trusts. They held huge portfolios of common stocks, and obviously they could not afford to have them become cheap. Also, they had cash. So if stocks did become cheap, the investment trusts would be in the market picking up bargains. This would mean that the bargains wouldn't last. With so many people wanting to avoid a further fall would clearly be avoided. In the ensuing weeks, the Sabbath pause had a marked tendency to breed uneasiness and doubts and pessimism and a decision to get out on Monday. This, it seems certain, was what happened on Sunday, October 20th. 4. Monday, October 21st, was a very poor day. Sales totaled 6,091,870, the 3rd greatest volume in history, and some tens of thousands who were watching the market throughout the country made a disturbing discovery. There was no way of telling what was happening. Previously, on big days of the bull market, the ticker had often fallen behind, and one didn't discover until well after the market closed how much richer he had become. But the experience with a falling market had been much more limited. Not since March had the ticker fallen seriously behind on declining values. Many now learned for the first time that they could be ruined, totally and forever, and not even know it. And if they were not ruined, there was a strong tendency to imagine it. From the opening on the 21st, the ticker lagged, and by noon, it was an hour late. Not until an hour and 40 minutes after the close of the market did it record the last transaction. Every 10 minutes, prices of selected stocks were printed on the bond ticker. But the wide divergence between these and the prices on the tape only added to the uneasiness and to the growing conviction that it might be best to sell. Things, though bad, were still not hopeless. Toward the end of Monday's trading, the market rallied, and final prices were above the lows for the day. The net losses were considerably less than on Saturday. Tuesday brought a somewhat shaky gain. As so often before, the market seemed to be showing its ability to come back. People got ready to record the experience as merely another setback, of which there had been so many previously. In doing so, they were helped by the two men who now were recognized as Wall Street's official prophets. On Monday in New York, Professor Fisher said that the decline had represented only a shaking out of the lunatic fringe. He went on to explain why he felt that the prices of stocks during the boom had not caught up with their real value and would go higher. Among other things, the market had not yet reflected the beneficent effects of prohibition, which had made the American worker more productive and dependable. On Tuesday, Charles E. Mitchell dropped anchor in New York with the observation that the decline had gone too far. Time and sundry congressional and court proceedings were to show that Mr. Mitchell had strong personal reasons for feeling that way. He added that conditions were fundamentally sound, said again that too much attention had been paid to the large volume of brokers' loans, and concluded that the situation was one which would correct itself if left alone. However, another jarring suggestion came from Babson. He recommended selling stocks and buying gold. By Wednesday, October 23rd, the effect of this cheer was somehow dissipated. Instead of further gains, there were heavy losses. The opening was quiet enough, but toward mid-morning, motor accessory stocks were sold heavily, and volume began to increase throughout the list. The last hour was quite phenomenal. 2,600,000 shares changed hands at rapidly declining prices. The Times Industrial Average for the day dropped from 415 to 384, giving up all of its gains since the end of the previous June. Tel lost 15 points, General Electric 20, Westinghouse 25, and J.I. Case another 46. Again, the ticker was far behind, and to add to the uncertainty, an ice storm in the Middle West caused widespread disruption of communications. That afternoon and evening, thousands of speculators decided to get out while, as they mistakenly supposed, the getting was good. Other thousands were told they had no choice but to get out unless they posted more collateral. For as the day's business came to an end, an unprecedented volume of margin calls went out. Speaking in Washington, even Professor Fisher was fractionally less optimistic. He told a meeting of bankers that security values, in most instances, were not inflated. However, he did not weaken on the unrealized efficiencies of prohibition. The papers that night went to press with a souvenir of a fast-departing era. Formidable advertisements announced subscription rights and a new offering of certificates in Aktiebolaget, Kruger & Toll at $23. There was also one bit of cheer. It was predicted that on the morrow, the market would surely begin to receive organized support. 5. Thursday, October 24th, is the first of the days which history, such as it is on the subject, identifies with the Panic of 1929. Measured by disorder, fright, and confusion, it deserves to be so regarded. That day, 12,894,650 shares changed hands, many of them at prices which shattered the dreams and the hopes of those who had owned them. Of all the mysteries of the stock exchange, there is none so impenetrable as why there should be a buyer for everyone who seeks to sell. October 24, 1929 showed that what is mysterious is not inevitable. Often, there were no buyers, and only after wide vertical declines could anyone be induced to bid. The panic did not last all day. It was a phenomenon of the morning hours. The market opening itself was unspectacular, and for a while prices were firm. Volume, however, was very large, and soon prices began to sag. Once again, the ticker dropped behind. Prices fell farther and faster, and the ticker lagged more and more. By 11 o'clock, the market had degenerated into a wild, mad scramble to sell. In the crowded boardrooms across the country, the ticker told of a frightful collapse. But the selected quotations coming in over the bond ticker also showed that current values were far below the ancient history of the tape. The uncertainty led more and more people to try to sell. Others, no longer able to respond to margin calls, were sold out. By 11:30, the market had surrendered to blind, relentless fear. This, indeed, was panic. Outside the exchange in Broad Street, a weird roar could be heard. A crowd gathered. Police Commissioner Grover Whalen became aware that something was happening and dispatched a special police detail to Wall Street to ensure the peace. More people came and waited, though apparently no one knew for what. A workman appeared atop one of the high buildings to accomplish some repairs, and the multitude assumed he was a would-be suicide and waited impatiently for him to jump. Crowds also formed around the branch offices of brokerage firms throughout the city, and indeed, throughout the country. Word of what was happening, or what was thought to be happening, was passed out by those who were within sight of the board or the Translux. An observer thought that people's expressions showed not so much suffering as a sort of horrified incredulity. Rumor after rumor swept Wall Street and these outlying wakes. Stocks were now selling for nothing. The Chicago and Buffalo exchanges had closed. A suicide wave was in progress, and 11 well-known speculators had already killed themselves. At 12:30, the officials of the New York Stock Exchange closed the visitors' gallery on the wild scenes below. One of the visitors who had just departed was showing his remarkable ability to be on hand with history. He was the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Winston Churchill. It was he who in 1925 returned Britain to the gold standard and the overvalued pound. Accordingly, he was responsible for the strain which sent Montague Norman to plead in New York for easier money, which caused credit to be eased at the fatal time, which, in this Academy view, in turn caused the boom. Now Churchill, it could be imagined, was viewing his awful handiwork. There is no record of anyone's having reproached him. Economics was never his strong point, so, and wisely, it seems most unlikely that he reproached himself. 6. In New York, at least, the panic was over by noon. At noon, the organized support appeared. At 12 o'clock, reporters learned that a meeting was convening at 23 Wall Street at the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company. The word quickly passed as to who was there. Charles E. Mitchell, the chairman of the board of the National City Bank. Albert H. Wiggin, the chairman of the Chase National Bank. William C. Potter, the president of the Guarantee Trust Company. Seward Prosser, the chairman of the Bankers Trust Company. And the host, Thomas W. Lamont, the senior partner of Morgan's. According to legend, during the Panic of 1907, the elder Morgan had brought to a halt the discussion of whether to save the tottering Trust Company of America by saying that the place to stop the panic was there. It was stopped. Now, 22 years later, that drama was being reenacted. The elder Morgan was dead. His son was in Europe. But equally determined men were moving in. They were the nation's most powerful financiers. They had not yet been pilloried and maligned by new dealers. The very news that they would act would release people from the fear to which they had surrendered. It did. a decision was quickly reached to pool resources to support the market. The meeting broke up, and Thomas Lamont met with reporters. His manner was described as serious, but his words were reassuring. In what Frederick Lewis Allen later called one of the most remarkable understatements of all time, he told the newspapermen, "There has been a little distress selling on the stock exchange." He added that this was due to a technical condition of the market, rather than any fundamental cause, and told the newsmen that things were susceptible to betterment. The bankers, he let it be known, had decided to better things. Word had already reached the floor of the exchange that the bankers were meeting, and the news ticker had spread the magic word afield. Prices firmed at once and started to rise. Then at 1:30, Richard Whitney appeared on the floor and went to the post where steel was traded. Whitney was perhaps the best-known figure on the floor. He was one of the group of men of good background and appropriate education who, in that time, were expected to manage the affairs of the exchange. Currently, he was vice president of the exchange. But in the absence of E.H.H. Simmons in Hawaii, he was serving as acting president. What was much more important at the moment, he was known as floor trader for Morgan's, and indeed, his older brother was a Morgan partner. As he made his way through the teeming crowd, Whitney appeared debonair and self-confident. Some later described his manner as jaunty. His own firm dealt largely in bonds, so it is improbable that he had been much involved in the turmoil of the morning. At the steel post, he bid $205 for 10,000 shares. This was the price of the last sale, and the current bids were several points lower. In an operation that was totally devoid of normal commercial reticence, he got 200 shares and then left the rest of the order with the specialist. He continued on his way, placing similar orders for 15 or 20 other stocks. This was it. The bankers obviously had moved in. The effect was electric. Fear vanished and gave way to concern lest the new advance be missed. Prices boomed upward. The bankers had indeed brought off a notable coup. Prices, as they fell that morning, kept crossing a large volume of stop-loss orders calling for sales whenever a specified price was reached. Brokers had placed many of these orders for their own protection on the securities of customers who had not responded to calls for additional margin. Each of these stop-loss orders tripped more securities into the market and drove prices down farther. Each spasm of liquidation thus ensured that another would follow. It was this literal chain reaction which the bankers checked, and they checked it decisively. In the closing hour, selling orders continuing to come in from across the country turned the market soft once more. Still, in its own way, the recovery on Black Thursday was as remarkable as the selling that made it so black. The Times Industrials were off only 12 points, or a little more than a third of the loss of the previous day. Steel, the stock that Whitney had singled out to start the recovery, had opened that morning at 205.5, a point or two above the previous close. At the lowest, it was down to 193.5 for a 12-point loss. Then it recovered to close at 206 for a surprising net gain of 2 points for this day. Montgomery Ward, which had opened at 83 and gone to 50, came back to 74. General Electric was at one point 32 points below its opening price, and then came back 25 points. On the curb, Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation opened at 81, dropped to 65, and then came back to 80. J.I. Case, maintaining a reputation for eccentric behavior that had brought much risk capital into the threshing machine business, made a net gain of 7 points for the day. Many had good reason to be grateful to the financial leaders of Wall Street. 7. Not everyone could be grateful, to be sure. Across the country, people were only dimly aware of the improvement. By early afternoon, when the market started up, the ticker was hours behind. Although the spot quotations on the bond ticker showed the improvement, the ticker itself continued to grind out the most dismal of news, and the news on the ticker was what counted. To many, many watchers, it meant that they had been sold out, and that their dream, In fact, their brief reality of opulence had gone glimmering, together with home, car, furs, jewelry, and reputation. That the market, after breaking them, had recovered was the most chilling of comfort. It was 8.5 minutes past 7 that night before the ticker finished recording the day's misfortunes. In the boardrooms, speculators who had been sold out since morning sat silently watching the tape. The habit of months or years, however idle it had now become, could not be abandoned at once. Then, as the final trades were registered, sorrowfully or grimly, according to their nature, they made their way out into the gathering night. In Wall Street itself, lights blazed from every office as clerks struggled to come abreast of the day's business. Messengers and boardroom boys, caught up in the excitement and untroubled by losses, went skylarking through the streets until the police arrived to quell them. Representatives of 35 of the largest wirehouses assembled at the offices of Hornblower and Weeks and told the press on departing that the market was fundamentally sound and technically in better condition than it has been in months. It was the unanimous view of those present that the worst had passed. The host firm dispatched a market letter which stated that, commencing with today's trading, the market should start laying the foundation for the constructive advance which we believe will characterize 1930. Charles E. Mitchell announced that the trouble was purely technical and that fundamentals remained unimpaired. Senator Carter Glass said the trouble was due largely to Charles E. Mitchell. Senator Wilson of Indiana attributed the crash to Democratic resistance to a higher tariff. 8. On Friday and Saturday, trading continued heavy. Just under $6 million on Friday and over $2 million at the short session on Saturday. Prices, on the whole, were steady. The averages were a trifle up on Friday, but slid off on Saturday. It was thought that the bankers were able to dispose of most of the securities they had acquired while shoring up the market on Thursday. Not only were things better, but everyone was clear as to who had made them so. The bankers had shown both their courage and their power, and the people applauded warmly and generously. The financial community, the Times said, now felt secure in the knowledge that the most powerful banks in the country stood ready to prevent a recurrence of panic. As a result, it had relaxed its anxiety. Perhaps never before or since have so many people taken the measure of economic prospects and found them so favorable as in the 2 days following the Thursday disaster. The optimism even included a note of self-congratulation. Colonel Ayres in Cleveland thought that no other country could have come through such a bad crash so well. Others pointed out that the prospects for business were good, and that the stock market debacle would not make them any less favorable. No one knew, but it cannot be stressed too frequently that for effective incantation, knowledge is neither necessary nor assumed. Eugene M. Stevens, the president of the Continental Illinois Bank, said, "There is nothing in the business situation to justify any nervousness." Walter Teagle said there had been no fundamental change in the oil business to justify concern. Charles M. Schwab said that the steel business had been making fundamental progress toward stability, and added that this fundamentally sound condition was responsible for the prosperity of the industry. Samuel Vauquelin, chairman of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, declared that fundamentals are sound. President Hoover said that the fundamental business of the country, that is, production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis. President Hoover was asked to say something more specific about the market, for example, that stocks were now cheap, but he refused. Many others joined in. Howard C. Hopson, the head of Associated Gas and Electric, omitted the standard reference to fundamentals and thought it was undoubtedly beneficial to the business interests of the country to have the gambling type of speculator eliminated. Mr. Hopson, himself a speculator, although more of the sure thing type, was also eliminated in due course. A Boston investment trust took space in the Wall Street Journal to say, "Steady, everybody. Calm thinking is in order. Heed the words of America's greatest bankers. A single dissonant note, though great in portent, went unnoticed. Speaking in Poughkeepsie, Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt criticized the fever of speculation. On Sunday, there were sermons suggesting that a certain measure of divine retribution had been visited on the Republic, and that it had not been entirely unmerited. People had lost sight of spiritual values in their single-minded pursuit of riches. Now they had had their lesson. Almost everyone believed that the heavenly knuckle-rapping was over, and that speculation could be now resumed in earnest. The papers were full of the prospects for next week's market. Stocks, it was agreed, were again cheap, and accordingly there would be a heavy rush to buy. Numerous stories from the brokerage houses, some of them possibly inspired, told of a fabulous volume of buying orders which was piling up in anticipation of the opening of the market. In a concerted advertising campaign in Monday's papers, stock market firms urged the wisdom of picking up these bargains promptly. "We believe," said one house, "that the investor who purchases securities at this time, with the discrimination that is always a condition of prudent investing, may do so with utmost confidence." On Monday, the real disaster began. Chapter 6. Things become more serious. In the autumn of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange, under roughly its present constitution, was 112 years old. During this lifetime, it had seen some difficult days. On September 18, 1873, the firm of J. Cook & Company failed, and, as a more or less direct result, so did 57 other stock exchange firms in the next few weeks. On October 23, 1907, call money rates reached 125% in the panic of that year. On September 16, 1920, the autumn months are the off-season in Wall Street, a bomb exploded in front of Morgan's next door, killing 30 people and injuring 100 more. A common feature of all these earlier troubles was that having happened, they were over. The worst was reasonably recognizable as such. The singular feature of the great crash of 1929 was that the worst continued to worsen. What looked one day like the end proved on the next day to have been only the beginning. Nothing could have been more ingeniously designed to maximize the suffering, and also to ensure that as few people as possible escaped the common misfortune. The fortunate speculator who had funds to answer the first margin call presently got another and equally urgent one, and if he met that, there would still be another. In the end, all the money he had was extracted from him and lost. The man with the smart money, who was safely out of the market when the first crash came, naturally went back in to pick up bargains. Not only were a recorded 12,894,650 shares sold on October 24th, precisely the same number were bought. The bargains then suffered a ruinous fall. Even the man who waited out all of October and all of November, who saw the volume of trading return to normal and saw Wall Street become as placid as a produce market, and who then bought common stocks, would see their value drop to a third or a fourth of the purchase price in the next 24 months. The Coolidge bull market was a remarkable phenomenon. The ruthlessness of its liquidation was, in its own way, equally remarkable. 2. Monday, October 28th, was the first day on which this process of climax and anticlimax ad infinitum began to reveal itself. It was another terrible day. Volume was huge, although below the previous Thursday. 9.25 million shares, as compared with nearly 13. But the losses were far more severe. The Times Industrials were down 49 points for the day. General Electric was off 48. Westinghouse 34. Tel 34. Steel went down 18 points. Indeed, the decline on this one day was greater than that of all the preceding week of panic. Once again, a late ticker left everyone in ignorance of what was happening, save that it was bad. On this day, there was no recovery. At 1:10, Charles E. Mitchell was observed going into Morgan's, and the news ticker carried the magic word. Steel rallied and went from 194 to 198, but Richard Whitney did not materialize. It seems probable in light of later knowledge that Mitchell was on the way to float a personal loan. The market weakened again, and in the last hour, a phenomenal 3 million shares, a big day's business before and ever since, changed hands at rapidly falling prices. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the bankers assembled once more at Morgan's, and they remained in session until 6:30. They were described as taking a philosophical attitude, and they told the press that the situation retained hopeful features, although these were not specified. But the statement they released after the meeting made clear what had been discussed for the 2 hours. It was no part of the bankers' purpose, the statement said, to maintain any particular level of prices or to protect anyone's profit. Rather, the aim was to have an orderly market, one in which offers would be met by bids at some price. The bankers were only concerned that air holes, as Mr. Lamont had dubbed them, did not appear. Like many lesser men, Mr. Lamont and his colleagues had suddenly found themselves overcommitted on a falling market. The time had come to go short on promises. Support, organized or otherwise, could not contend with the overwhelming pathological desire to sell. The meeting had considered how to liquidate the commitment to support the market without adding to the public perturbation. The formula that was found was a chilling one. On Thursday, Whitney had supported prices and protected profits, or stopped losses. This was what people wanted. To the man who held stock on margin, disaster had only one face, and that was falling prices. But now, prices were to be allowed to fall. The speculator's only comfort, henceforth, was that his ruin would be accomplished in an orderly and becoming manner. There were no recriminations at the time. Our political life favors the extremes of speech. The man who is gifted in the arts of abuse is bound to be a notable, if not always a great figure. In business, things are different. Here, we are surprisingly gentle and forbearing. Even preposterous claims or excuses are normally taken, at least for all public purposes, at their face value. On the evening of the 28th, no one any longer could feel secure in the knowledge that the most powerful banks stood ready to prevent a recurrence of panic. The market had reasserted itself as an impersonal force beyond the power of any person to control. And, while this is the way markets are supposed to be, it was horrible. But no one assailed the bankers for letting the people down. There was even some talk that on the next day, the market might receive organized support. 3. Tuesday, October 29th, was the most devastating day in the history of the New York stock market. And it may have been the most devastating day in the history of markets. It combined all of the bad features of all of the bad days before. Volume was immensely greater than on Black Thursday. The drop in prices was almost as great as on Monday. Uncertainty and alarm were as great as on either. Selling began as soon as the market opened, and in huge volume. Great blocks of stock were offered for what they would bring. In the first half hour, sales were at a 33 million a day rate. The air holes, which the bankers were to close, opened wide. Repeatedly, and in many issues, there was a plethora of selling orders, and no buyers at all. The stock of White Sewing Machine Company, which had reached a high of 48 in the months preceding, had closed at 11 the night before. During the day, someone, according to Frederick Lewis Allen, it was thought to have been a bright messenger boy for the exchange, had the happy idea of entering a bid for a block of stock at $1 a share. In the absence of any other bid, he got it. Once again, of course, the ticker lagged. And at the close, it was 2.5 hours behind. By then, 16,410,030 sales had been recorded on the New York Stock Exchange. Some certainly went unrecorded, or more than 3 times the number that was once considered a fabulously big day. The Times industrial averages were down 43 points, canceling all of the gains of the 12 wonderful months preceding. The losses would have been worse had there not been a closing rally. Thus, steel, for which Whitney had bid $205 on Thursday, reached $167 during the course of the day, although it rallied to $174 at the close. American Can opened at $130, dropped to $110, and rose to $120. Westinghouse opened at $131. On September 3rd, it had closed at $286 and dropped to $100. Then it rallied to $126. But the worst thing that happened on this terrible day was to the investment trusts. Not only did they go down, but it became apparent that they could go practically to nothing. Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation had closed at 60 the night before. During the day, it dropped to 35 and closed at that level, off by not far short of half. Blue Ridge, its offspring once removed, on which the magic of leverage was now working in reverse, did much worse. Early in September, it had sold at 24. By October 24th, it was down to 12. But it resisted rather well the misfortunes of that day and the day following. On the morning of October 29th, it opened at 10 and promptly slipped to 3, giving up more than 2/3 of its value. It recovered later, but other investment trusts did less well. Their stock couldn't be sold at all. The worst day on Wall Street came eventually to an end. Once again, the lights blazed all night. Members of the exchange, their employees, and the employees of the stock exchange, by now, were reaching the breaking point from strain and fatigue. In this condition, they faced the task of recording and handling the greatest volume of transactions ever. All of this was without the previous certainty that things might get better. They might go on getting worse. In one house, an employee fainted from exhaustion, was revived, and put back to work again. 4. In the first week, the slaughter had been of the innocents. During this second week, there is some evidence that it was the well-to-do and the wealthy who were being subjected to a leveling process comparable in magnitude and suddenness to that presided over a decade before by Lenin. The size of the blocks of stock which were offered suggested that big speculators were selling or being sold. Another indication came from the boardrooms. A week before, they were crowded. Now, they were nearly empty. Those now in trouble had facilities for suffering in private. The bankers met twice on the 29th, at noon and again in the evening. There was no suggestion that they were philosophical. This was hardly remarkable because, during the day, an appalling rumor had swept the exchange. It was that the bankers' pool, so far from stabilizing the market, was actually selling stocks. The prestige of the bankers had, in truth, been falling even more rapidly than the market. After the evening session, Mr. Lamont met the press with the disenchanting task of denying that they had been liquidating securities or participating in a bear raid. After explaining again, somewhat redundantly in view of the day's events, that it was not the purpose of the bankers to maintain a particular level of prices, he concluded, "The group has continued and will continue in a cooperative way to support the market and has not been a seller of stocks." In fact, as later intelligence revealed, Albert H. Wiggin of the Chase was personally short at the time to the tune of some millions. His cooperative support, which if successful would have cost him heavily, must have had an interesting element of ambivalence. So ended the organized support. The phrase recurred during the next few days, but no one again saw in it any ground for hope. Few men ever lost position so rapidly as did the New York bankers in the 5 days from October 24th to October 29th. The crash on October 24th was the signal for corporations and out-of-town banks, which had been luxuriating in the 10% and more rate of interest, to recall their money from Wall Street. Between October 23rd and October 30th, as values fell and margin accounts were liquidated, the volume of brokers' loans fell by over $1 billion. But the corporations and the out-of-town banks responded to the horrifying news from New York, although in fact their funds were never seriously endangered, by calling home over $2 billion. The New York banks stepped into the gaping hole that was left by these summer financiers, and during that first week of crisis, they increased their loans by about $1 billion. This was a bold step. Had the New York banks succumbed to the general fright, a money panic would have been added to the other woes. Stocks would have been dumped because their owners could not have borrowed money at any price to carry them. To prevent this was a considerable achievement for which all who owned stocks should have been thankful. But the banks received no credit. People remembered only that they had bravely undertaken to stem the price collapse and had failed. Despite a flattering supposition to the contrary, people came readily to terms with power. There is little reason to think that the power of the great bankers, while they were assumed to have it, was much resented. But as the ghosts of numerous tyrants, from Julius Caesar to Benito Mussolini, will testify, people are very hard on those who, having had power, lose it or are destroyed. Then, anger at past arrogance is joined with contempt for present weakness. The victim, or his corpse, is made to suffer all available indignities. Such was the fate of the bankers. For the next decade, they were fair game for congressional committees, courts, the press, and the comedians. The great pretensions and the great failures of these days were a cause. A banker need not be popular. Indeed, a good banker in a healthy capitalist society should probably be much disliked. People do not wish to trust their money to a "hail fellow, well met," but to a misanthrope who can say no. However, a banker must not seem futile, ineffective, or vaguely foolish. In contrast with the stern power of Morgan in 1907, that was precisely how his successors seemed, or were made to seem, in 1929. The failure of the bankers did not leave the community entirely without constructive leadership. There was Mayor James J. Walker. Appearing before a meeting of motion picture exhibitors on that Tuesday, he appealed to them to show pictures which will reinstate courage and hope in the hearts of the people. 5. On the exchange itself, there was a strong feeling that courage and hope might best be restored by just closing up for a while. This feeling had, in fact, been gaining force for several days. Now it derived support from the simple circumstance that everyone was badly in need of sleep. Employees of some stock exchange firms had not been home for days. Hotel rooms in downtown New York were at a premium, and restaurants in the financial area had gone on to a 15- and 20-hour day. Nerves were bad, and mistakes were becoming increasingly common. After the close of trading on Tuesday, a broker found a large wastebasket of unexecuted orders which he had set aside for early attention and had totally forgotten. One customer, whose margin account was impaired, was sold out twice. A number of firms needed some time to see if they were still solvent. There were, in fact, no important failures by stock exchange firms during these days, although one firm had reported itself bankrupt as the result of a clerical error by an employee who was in the last stages of fatigue. Yet to close the exchange was a serious matter. It might somehow signify that stocks had lost all their value, with consequences no one could foresee. In any case, securities would immediately become a badly frozen asset. This would be hard on the wholly solvent investors who might need to realize on them or use them as collateral. And sooner or later, a new gutter market would develop in which individuals would informally dispose of stocks to those increasingly exceptional individuals who still wanted to buy them. In 1929, the New York Stock Exchange was, in principle, a sovereignty of its members. Apart from the general statutes relating to the conduct of business and the prevention of fraud, it was subject to no important state or federal regulation. This meant a considerable exercise of self-government. Legislation governing the conduct of trading had to be kept under review and enforced. Stocks had to be approved for listing. The building and other facilities of the exchange had to be managed. As with the United States Congress, most of this work was done in committees. These, in turn, were dominated by a somewhat smaller group of members who were expected and accustomed to run things. A decision to close the exchange had to be taken by the governing committee, a body of about 40 members. The mere knowledge that this body was meeting would almost certainly have an unfavorable effect on the market. Nonetheless, at noon on Tuesday the 29th, a meeting was held. The members of the committee left the floor in twos and threes and went not to the regular meeting room, but to the office of the president of the Stock Clearing Corporation, directly below the trading floor. Some months later, Acting President Whitney described the session with considerable graphic talent. The office they met in was never designed for large meetings of this sort, with the result that most of the governors were compelled to stand or to sit on tables. As the meeting proceeded, panic was raging overhead on the floor. Every few minutes, the latest prices were announced, with quotations moving swiftly and irresistibly downwards. The feeling of those present was revealed by their habit of continually lighting cigarettes, taking a puff or two, putting them out, and lighting new ones, a practice which soon made the narrow room blue with smoke and extremely stuffy. The result of these nervous deliberations was a decision to meet again in the evening. By evening, the late rally had occurred, and it was decided to stay open for another day. The next day, a further formula was hit upon. The exchange would stay open, but it would have some special holidays and then go on short hours, and this would be announced just as soon as the market seemed strong enough to stand it. Many still wanted to close. Whitney said later, although no doubt with some exaggeration, that in the days to come, the authorities of the exchange led the life of hunted things, until eventually the desirability of holding the market open became apparent to all. 6. The next day, those forces were at work which on occasion bring salvation precisely when salvation seems impossible. Stocks rose wonderfully, miraculously, though still on enormous volume. The Times Industrials were up 31 points for the day, thus recouping a large part of the terrible losses of the day before. Why this recovery occurred, no one will ever know. Organized support can have no credit. Organized reassurance has a somewhat better claim. On the evening of the 29th, Dr. Julius Klein, Assistant Secretary of Commerce, friend of President Hoover, and the senior apostle of the official economic view, took to the radio to remind the country that President Hoover had said that the fundamental business of the country was sound. He added firmly, "The main point which I want to emphasize is the fundamental soundness of the great mass of economic activities." On Wednesday, Waddell Ketchings, of Goldman Sachs, announced on return from a Western trip that general business conditions were unquestionably fundamentally sound. The same, by then, could not unquestionably be said of all Goldman Sachs. Arthur Brisbane told Hearst readers, "To comfort yourself, if you lost, think of the people living near Mount Pelée, ordered to abandon their homes." Most important, perhaps, from Pocantico Hills came the first public statement by John D. Rockefeller in several decades. So far as the record shows, it was spontaneous. However, someone in Wall Street, perhaps someone who knew that another appeal to President Hoover to say something specifically encouraging about stocks would be useless, may have realized that a statement from Rockefeller would, if anything, be better. The statement ran, "Believing that fundamental conditions of the country are sound, my son and I have for some days been purchasing sound common stocks." The statement was widely applauded, although Eddie Cantor, describing himself as comedian, author, statistician, and victim, said later, "Sure, who else had any money left?" The accepted Wall Street explanation of Wednesday's miracle was not the reassurance, but the dividend news of the day before. This also, without much question, was somewhat organized. U.S. Steel had declared an extra dividend. American Can had not only declared an extra, but had increased its regular dividend. These errant sunbeams were deeply welcome in the dark canyons of Lower Manhattan. Just before the Rockefeller statement arrived, things looked good enough on the exchange, so that Richard Whitney felt safe in announcing that the market would not open until noon the following day, Thursday, and that on Friday and Saturday it would stay shut. The announcement was greeted by cheers. Nerves were clearly past the breaking point. On LaSalle Street in Chicago, a boy exploded a firecracker. Like wildfire, the rumor spread that gangsters, whose margin accounts had been closed out, were shooting up the street. Several squad cars of police arrived to make them take their losses like honest men. In New York, the body of a commission merchant was fished out of the Hudson. The pockets contained $9.40 in change and some margin calls. 7. At the short session of 3 hours on Thursday, October 31st, well over 7 million shares were traded, and the market made another good gain. The Times Industrials were up 21 points. The weekly return of the Federal Reserve Bank showed a drop in brokers' loans by more than $1 billion, the largest weekly drop on record. Margin requirements had already been cut to 25%. Now the Federal Reserve Banks lowered the rediscount rate from 6 to 5%. The reserve banks also launched vigorous open market purchases of bonds to ease money rates and liberalize the supply of credit. The boom had collapsed. The restraint that had previously been contemplated could now give way to a policy of active encouragement to the market. On all these happy portents, the market closed down for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. They were not days of rest. Brokerage offices were fully staffed, and the exchange floor was open for completion of trades, and also for straightening out innumerable misunderstandings and mistakes. It was noted that on Friday, a visitor to the galleries could not have told the market was suspended. The weekend brought one piece of bad news. That was the announcement on Saturday of the failure of the $20 million Fauché Enterprises of Minneapolis. Fauché owned utilities in some 12 states, Canada, Mexico, and Central America, and an assortment of hotels, flour mills, banks, manufacturing and retail establishments wherever he had happened to buy them. The 32-story obelisk, commemorating the enterprise, which still dominates the Minneapolis skyline, had been opened with fitting ceremony by Secretary of War James W. Good only in August. Secretary Good had referred to it as the Washington Monument of the Northwest. By all but the most technical of considerations, Fauché was bankrupt at that festive time. His survival depended on his ability to continue merchandising stock to the public. The market crash eliminated this source of revenue and made him dependent on the wholly inadequate earnings of his enterprises. On all other fronts, the news was all good. Alfred P. Sloan, Jr., president of the General Motors Corporation, said, "Business is sound." The Ford Motor Company emphasized a similar conviction by announcing a general reduction in its prices. "We feel that such a step is the best contribution that could be made to assure a continuation of good business." The Roadster was cut from $450 to $435. The Phaeton from $460 to $440. The Tudor sedan from $525 to $500. For the 3 days that the market was closed, the papers carried stories of the accumulation of buying orders, and, in some indefinable way, the stories had a greater ring of conviction than the week before. The market, after all, had closed after an excellent 2-day rally. As Barron's pointed out, it could now be believed that stocks were selling ex-hopes and romance. On Monday, the Commercial National Bank and Trust Company took 5 columns in the Times to advertise our belief and conviction that the general industrial and business condition of the country is fundamentally sound and is essentially unimpaired. That day, the market started on another ghastly slump. 8. Over the weekend, the financial community had almost certainly been persuaded by its own organized and spontaneous efforts at cheer. The papers described the reaction of professional Wall Street to Monday's market as one of stunned surprise, disbelief, and shock. Volume was smaller than the week before, but still well above 6 million. The whole list was weak. Individual issues made big losses. the Times Industrials were down 22 points for the day. Compared with anything but the week before, this was very bad. When measured against the bright hopes for that day, it was most distressing. Explanations varied. The rumor recurred that the organized support was selling stocks, and Mr. Lamont, on meeting the press, added a minor footnote to this now completed story. He said he didn't know. The organized support was really not that well organized. The most plausible explanation is that everyone was feeling cheerful, but the public. As before and later, the weekend had been a time of thought, and out of thought had come pessimism and a decision to sell. So, as on other Mondays, no matter how cheerful the superficial portents, the selling orders poured in volume. By now, it was also evident that the investment trusts, once considered a buttress of the high plateau and a built-in defense against collapse, were really a profound source of weakness. The leverage, of which people only a fortnight before had spoken so knowledgeably and even affectionately, was now fully in reverse. With remarkable celerity, it removed all of the value from the common stock of a trust. As before, the case of a typical trust, a small one, is worth contemplating. Let it be supposed that it had securities in the hands of the public which had a market value of $10 million in early October. Of this, half was in common stock, half in bonds and preferred stock. These securities were fully covered by the current market value of the securities owned. In other words, the trust's portfolio contained securities with a market value also of $10 million. A representative portfolio of securities owned by such a trust would, in the early days of November, have declined in value by perhaps half. Values of many of these securities by later standards would still be handsome. On November 4th, the low for Tel was still 233. For General Electric, it was 234, and for steel, 183. The new portfolio value, $5 million, would be only enough to cover the prior claim on assets of the bonds and preferred stock. The common stock would have nothing behind it. Apart from expectations, which were by no means bright, it was now worthless. This geometrical ruthlessness was not exceptional. On the contrary, it was everywhere at work on the stock of the leverage trusts. By early November, the stock of most of them had become virtually unsaleable. To make matters worse, many of them were traded on the curb or the out-of-town exchanges, where buyers were few and the markets thin. Never was there a time when more people wanted more money more urgently than in those days. The word that a man had got caught by the market was a signal for his creditors to descend on him like locusts. Many who were having trouble meeting their margin calls wanted to sell some stocks so they could hold the rest and thus salvage something from their misfortunes. But such people now found that their investment trust securities could not be sold for any appreciable sum, and perhaps not at all. They were forced, as a result, to realize on their good securities. Standard stocks like Steel, General Motors, Tel were thus dumped on the market in abnormal volume, with the effect on prices that had already been fully revealed. The great investment trust boom had ended in a unique manifestation of Gresham's law, in which the bad stocks were driving out the good. The stabilizing effects of the huge cash resources of the investment trusts had also proved a mirage. In the early autumn, the cash and liquid resources of the investment trusts were large. Many trusts had been attracted by the handsome returns in the call market. The speculative circle had been closed. People who speculated in the stock of investment trusts were, in effect, investing in companies which provided the funds to finance their own speculation. But now, as reverse leverage did its work, investment trust managements were much more concerned over the collapse in the value of their own stock than in the adverse movements in the stock list as a whole. The investment trusts had invested heavily in each other. As a result, the fall in Blue Ridge hit Shenandoah, and the resulting collapse in Shenandoah was even more horrible for the Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation. Under these circumstances, many of the trusts used their available cash in a desperate effort to support their own stock. However, there was a vast difference between buying one stock now, when the public wanted to sell, and buying during the previous spring, as Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation had done, when the public wanted to buy and the resulting competition had sent prices higher and higher. Now the cash went out and the stock came in, and prices were either not perceptibly affected or not for long. What 6 months before had been a brilliant financial maneuver was now a form of fiscal self-immolation. In the last analysis, the purchase by a firm of its own stock is the exact opposite of the sale of stocks. It is by the sale of stock that firms ordinarily grow. However, none of this was immediately apparent. If one has been a financial genius, faith in one's genius does not dissolve at once. To the battered but unbowed genius, support of the stock of one's own company still seemed a bold, imaginative, and effective course. Indeed, it seemed the only alternative to slow but certain death. So, to the extent that their cash resources allowed, the managements of the trust chose faster, though equally certain death. They bought their own worthless stock. Men have been swindled by other men on many occasions. The autumn of 1929 was, perhaps, the first occasion when men succeeded on a large scale in swindling themselves. The time has now come to complete the chronicle of the last days of the crisis. 9. Tuesday, November 5th, was Election Day, and the market was closed all day. In the New York mayoralty race, the Democratic incumbent, James J. Walker, scored a landslide victory over his Republican opponent, F.H. LaGuardia, who had been soundly denounced by the Democrats as a socialist. Babson, in a statement, called for poise, discernment, judicious courage, and old-fashioned common sense. On Wednesday, the market reopened for the first of a new series of short sessions of 3 hours. These were the compromise on the question of closing, which had been reached the previous week. Nearly 6 million shares were traded in this session, or the equivalent of 10 million shares on a full day. There was another sickening slide. U.S. Steel opened at 181, and, by what one paper called a succession of feverish dips, went to 165. Auburn Automobile lost 66 points. Otis Elevator lost 45. The Times Industrials were off 37 points for the day, or only 6 points less than on the terrible Tuesday 8 days earlier. Where would it all end? There was also disturbing news from beyond the market. Fundamentals seemed to be turning sour. The week's figures on car loadings showed a heavy drop as compared with the year before. The steel rate was significantly down from the preceding week. More serious, the slump had extended to the commodity markets. On previous days, these had reacted sympathetically with the stock market. On this Wednesday, they had troubles of their own. Cotton was sharply off in the heaviest trading in weeks. References were made to panic in the wheat market when the price dropped vertically at noon. On Thursday, the stock market was steady to higher, but on Friday, it took a small drop. People had another weekend of contemplation. This time, there was no talk of an accumulation of buying orders. Indeed, there was little good news of any kind. On Monday, November 11th, came another drastic slump. For the next 2 days, trading was heavy. The exchange was still on short hours, and prices went down still more. In these 3 days, November 11th, 12th, and 13th, the Times Industrials lost another 50 points. Of all the days of the crash, these, without doubt, were the dreariest. Organized support had failed. For the moment, even organized reassurance had been abandoned. All that could be managed was some sardonic humor. It was noted that the margin calls going out by Western Union that week carried a small sticker. Remember them at home with a cheery Thanksgiving telegram, the American way for this American day. Clerks in downtown hotels were said to be asking guests whether they wished the room for sleeping or jumping. 2 men jumped hand in hand from a high window in the Ritz. They had a joint account. The Wall Street Journal, becoming biblical, told its readers, "Verily I say, let the fear of the market be the law of thy life. and abide by the words of the bond salesman. The financial editor of The Times, who by this time showed signs of being satisfied with the crash, and perhaps even a feeling that it had gone too far, said, "Probably none of the present generation will be able to speak again of a healthy reaction. There are many signs that the phrase is entirely out of date." Chapter 7. Aftermath 1. In the week or so following Black Thursday, the London penny press told delightedly of the scenes in downtown New York. Speculators were hurling themselves from windows. Pedestrians picked their way delicately between the bodies of fallen financiers. The American correspondent for The Economist wrote an indignant column for his paper protesting against this picture of imaginary carnage. In the United States, the suicide wave that followed the stock market crash is also a part of the legend of 1929. In fact, there was none. For several years before 1929, the suicide rate had been gradually rising. It continued to increase in that year, with a further and much sharper increase in 1930, 1931, and 1932. Years when there were many things besides the stock market to cause people to conclude that life was no longer worth living. The statistics for New Yorkers, who might be assumed to have had a special propensity for self-destruction, derived from their special propinquity to the market, show only a slight deviation from those for the country as a whole. Since the suicide myth is so well established, it may be useful to give the detailed figures. They are as follows. Number of suicides per 100,000 of population, 1925 to 1934. The first number is for the registration area, which is the part of the country, most of it, wherein causes of death are duly reported. The second number is for New York City. 1925, 12.1, 14.4. 1926, 12.8, 13.7. 1927, 13.3, 15.7. 1928, 13.6, 15.7. 1929, 14.0, 17.0. 1930, 15.7, 18.7. 1931, 16.8, 19.7. 1932, 17.4, 21.3. 1933, 15.9, 18.5. 1934, 14.9, 17.0. Since the market crash took place late in the year, there could have been a substantial increase in suicides in late October and thereafter, which still would not be great enough to affect the figures for the year as a whole. However, figures on the causes of death by months are also available for 1929. These show that the number of suicides in October and November was comparatively low. In October, 1,331 suicides in all the United States, and in November, 1,344. In only 3 other months, January, February, and September, did fewer people destroy themselves. During the summer months, when the market was doing beautifully, the number of suicides was substantially higher. One can only guess how the suicide myth became established. Like alcoholics and gamblers, broken speculators are supposed to have a propensity for self-destruction. At a time when broken speculators were plentiful, the newspapers and the public may have simply supplied the corollary. Alternatively, suicides that in other times would have evoked the question, "Why do you suppose he did it?" now had the motive assigned automatically. The poor fellow was caught in the crash. Finally, it must be noted that, although suicides did not increase sharply, either in the months of the crash or in 1929 as a whole, the rate did rise in the later Depression years. In memory, some of these tragedies may have been moved back a year or two to the time of the stock market crash. The weight of the evidence suggests that the newspapers and the public merely seized on such suicides as occurred to show that people were reacting appropriately to their misfortune. Enough deaths could be related in one way or another to the market to serve. Beginning soon after Black Thursday, Stories of violent self-destruction began to appear in the papers with some regularity. Curiously, though another myth runs strongly to the contrary, few people in these days followed the classical method of jumping from a high window. One would-be suicide jumped into the Schuylkill River, although he changed his mind when he hit the water and was fished out. The head of the Rochester Gas and Electric Company took gas. Another martyr dipped himself in gasoline and touched himself off. He not only made good his escape from his margin calls, but took his wife with him. There was also the suicide of J.J. Reardon. Reardon's death made large headlines in the newspapers on Sunday, November 10th. The papers obviously had sensed a story not only in his death itself, but also in the manner of its announcement. Reardon was a widely known and popular figure among New York Democrats. He had been treasurer of one of Mayor Walker's campaigns, and also of one of Al Smith's. He and Smith were close friends and business associates. Al Smith was a member of the board of directors of the recently organized County Trust Company, of which Reardon was the president. On Friday, November 8th, Reardon went to his bank, took a pistol from a teller's cage, went home, and shot himself. Al Smith was notified, and his sorrow over the death of his friend was not diminished by the knowledge that the news might start a serious run on their bank. A medical examiner was called, but further notification was withheld until the following day, Saturday, at noon, when the bank had closed for the weekend. There had been a long wake through which the distinguished mourners had kept one eye on the corpse and the other on the clock. The medical examiner first implied that he had postponed notification out of a feeling of deep responsibility for depositors of the county trust. This was a formidable exercise of discretion. Carried to its logical conclusion, it meant that all deaths would have to be weighed by the attending doctor for their financial consequences. Later, it was tacitly conceded that the decision was Al Smith's. So great was Smith's prestige, and also the general nervousness, that the action was not questioned. For some days, rumors had been circulating that Reardon had been wiped out by the crash. Now his friends rallied to his defense, some with vehement assertions that he never played the market. He had been deeply involved, as subsequent Senate committee investigations of the stock market revealed, but a hurried audit of the bank showed that all of its funds were intact. This fact was well publicized over the weekend. The city administration boldly